It's strange, isn't it? How some names barely make it into history books. And yet, when we stumble across them, they seem to carry with them a quiet weight. A name like Madge Kirby doesn't immediately spark recognition for most people today. She wasn't a powerful figure, a politician, or a wealthy heiress whose story was written in headlines. She was, by all accounts, just an ordinary woman, someone living her life in a small community, never expecting to be remembered not for her joys, but for the tragic way it ended. And yet, her story lingers like a shadow in the halls of true crime history. The case of Madge Kirby is unsettling, not because it was loud or sensational at the time, but because of how it faded into obscurity. And still, more than a century later, it refuses to let go. The details are fragmented, the records incomplete, and yet the core of the mystery, the unanswered questions about what really happened to her, continue to haunt those who come across her story. Was her death simply a cruel twist of fate, the kind of misfortune that could happen to anyone? Or was there something darker, something more sinister, lurking beneath the surface? What makes cases like Madge's so compelling is not just the crime itself, but the silence that surrounds it. We're left staring into a void of missing details, wondering how such a tragedy could have slipped through the cracks. And as you'll see, the circumstances of her case leave us with far more questions than answers. In this investigation, we'll step into the world Madge Kirby once knew. We'll explore her life before tragedy struck, piece together the events of the day that changed everything, and follow the investigation that struggled to bring clarity. We'll also walk through the leading theories, both the ones that seem obvious and the ones that are harder to explain. Finally, we'll confront the sobering reality of where the trail went cold, and why, to this day, the mystery of Madge Kirby remains unsolved. As we move through this story, I invite you to reflect with me. Because true crime is not just about the mystery, it's about the humanity at the center of it. Behind the uncertainty and speculation lies a woman who once laughed, worked, loved, and dreamed. Remembering her is just as important as questioning what happened. This is the story of Madge Kirby, a case that has remained unsolved, unanswered, and quietly haunting for generations. To understand the mystery of Madge Kirby, we first have to step back and see her as she was before her life became defined by its sudden and tragic end. Because before she was a name in a cold case file, she was a daughter, a neighbor, and a young woman living through a time of change. And it's here, in the quiet corners of her life, that we begin to understand who Madge was and why her loss mattered. Madge Kirby was born in the late 1800s, a time when communities were tight-knit and reputations carried weight. For families like hers, life was built on modest routines and shared values. From what little we know, Madge grew up in a household that emphasized hard work, decency, and community. She wasn't wealthy, but she wasn't destitute either. Her life reflected the rhythms of ordinary people, trying to build stability in a world that could be unforgiving. By her early 20s, Madge was described as bright, sociable, and well-liked in her community. She wasn't a celebrity or a person of scandal. She was simply someone you might have passed on the street without a second glance. And yet, the people who did know her remembered her as kind, thoughtful, and dependable. The kind of person you could trust with a secret or rely on in a moment of need. Madge had ambitions too, though they were modest by today's standards. In a society where many women of her class faced limited choices, she found purpose in her work. She is believed to have been employed in domestic service, possibly as a maid or a seamstress, which was common for young women at the time. The work was steady, if not glamorous, and it gave her a measure of independence. It also allowed her to contribute to her family's households, something she took pride in. But Madge's life wasn't defined by work alone. She enjoyed her social circle, which included friends from church and neighbors she had known since childhood. On weekends, she was likely to be seen walking through town, visiting shops, or joining others in simple community gatherings. These details may seem small, but they are what make her story feel real. She wasn't someone extraordinary in life, and yet in death she became unforgettable. Those who remembered Madge often described her as gentle but not timid. She had a quiet confidence, the kind that made her easy to talk to. She wasn't one to seek out conflict, but she also wasn't easily swayed by gossip or petty drama. In many ways, she embodied the resilience of women of her era, balancing duty with personal dignity, even when the world gave them few options. Her family, too, played an important role in shaping who she was. Madge's parents were known to be respectable, and she had siblings who shared in the ups and downs of daily life. Family bonds were vital in communities like hers, and it's likely she felt both the weight of responsibility and the comfort of belonging. Her relationships with them weren't just background details. They were central to her sense of self. And yet, beneath the ordinary surface of her life, there were hints of complexity. Some accounts suggest that Madge may have been in a relationship, or at least at the center of romantic speculation. In an era when young women were often judged harshly for even the slightest rumor, this could have made her more vulnerable than she realized. Was she being courted by someone who would later play a role in her disappearance? Or was she simply a young woman caught up in the ordinary tangle of affection, misunderstandings, and expectations? When you picture Madge in those last months of her life, it's important to imagine her not as a victim, but as a whole person. She may have dreamed of marriage, of creating a home of her own, or of building a small but meaningful future. She may have had private hopes and fears, just like anyone else. And that's what makes what happened to her so haunting, because behind the headlines and speculation was someone whose life was meant to stretch far beyond the moment it was cut short. If you had met her then, before everything changed, you likely wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. Madge didn't seem to carry secrets, and her days followed the same rhythms as countless others. Work, family, friends, and the occasional small joy. A familiar kind of life, one that feels relatable even across the gap of more than a century. And yet, when we look back now, knowing what we know, it's hard not to wonder if there were signs that something was wrong. Did she ever feel watched? Did she ever confide in someone that she was uneasy? Or was she truly unaware that her life was about to take a turn from ordinary to tragic? These are the questions that linger as we move forward in her story. For Madge Kirby, life before the incident was simple and filled with quiet promise. And perhaps that's what makes the events that followed so difficult to comprehend. She wasn't a woman living on the edge of scandal or danger. She was just Madge, an ordinary young woman whose story would become extraordinary, not because of what she did, but because of the way it ended. And so, as we step into the day everything changed, we carry with us the image of Madge Kirby, not as a case file, but as a person, someone with a family, a future, and a fragile humanity that still resonates today. Every case has a pivot point, a day when everything ordinary dissolves into uncertainty. For Madge Kirby, that day began like any other. But as the hours unfolded, her footsteps became the last traceable echoes of a life that would vanish into mystery. The morning of her disappearance started quietly. It was a cool, gray day, the kind of morning where the world feels muted, as though holding its breath. Madge was seen leaving the modest house she shared with her family, dressed neatly as she always was. Witnesses later recalled her attire: a simple dress, a dark coat, and her hair pinned in the tidy style she favored. Nothing about her appearance suggested distress or haste. Around 8 a.m., neighbors reported seeing her on the street, walking toward town. She exchanged polite greetings with an older woman tending her stoop. She seemed in good spirits, the woman later told police. There was nothing unusual. She smiled. From there, Madge likely followed her normal route past the cobblestone lanes, the grocers, and the small shops that lined the main street. People remembered her passing, though no one thought to note the details until later. At the time, it was simply routine. Madge Kirby, on her way somewhere, just like she had been countless times before. By 9:30 a.m., she was spotted at a dressmaker's shop where she occasionally worked. The owner said she stopped by briefly, not to begin her shift, but to collect something, possibly fabric she had been mending. She didn't linger. The owner later described her demeanor as calm, though a bit preoccupied, as though her mind was elsewhere. After that, the trail grows fainter. A shopkeeper claimed to have seen her around 10:15 a.m., browsing near a bookstall. Another woman swore Madge had been walking in the direction of the post office not long after. But none of these sightings could be confirmed with certainty. The times blurred together, and what seemed clear at first quickly became clouded in contradictions. By noon, Madge was expected back home. She had told her mother she would return for the midday meal. But when the family sat down at the table, her chair remained empty. At first, they thought little of it. Perhaps she had been delayed at work or had stopped to chat with a friend. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, unease began to settle. At 1:30 p.m., her younger brother went to look for her along her usual paths. He retraced her steps to the dressmaker's shop, then down to the market. No one had seen her since the late morning. A few shrugged and said she must have gone visiting. But those who knew Madge well found this explanation troubling. She was dependable, never one to disappear without word. The family waited through the afternoon, hoping she would walk through the door. Instead, silence deepened. By 4 p.m., neighbors were quietly whispering that something wasn't right. Her absence was becoming noticeable. That evening, when darkness fell and no one had word of her, the first sparks of panic began to ignite. A man later came forward with a strange account. Sometime around 5 p.m., he believed he saw Madge in conversation with a man near the edge of town. He couldn't describe the man clearly, only that he seemed older, and that Madge appeared hesitant, as though caught between staying and leaving. Others disputed the sighting, saying they had seen nothing. But this fragment of testimony would linger in the case file, raising questions about who she might have been with in her final hours. By 7 p.m., her family contacted local authorities. At first, the response was measured. Young women sometimes stayed out later than expected, the constable assured them. Perhaps she had gone visiting in another town. But Madge's family insisted this was unlike her. The night wore on, the streets quieting, and still there was no sign of her. Some neighbors remembered hearing noises that night, footsteps. A woman's raised voice, but no one could confirm if it was Madge. One farmer claimed he saw a lantern moving near the woods just outside town, sometime around 9:30 p.m., but he dismissed it at the time as someone traveling late. Only later, when the news of Madge's disappearance spread, did such details feel chilling. The next morning, the absence was undeniable. Her bed had not been slept in. Her belongings were untouched. It was as though she had stepped out into the day and simply dissolved into the shadows. In retrospect, what makes this timeline so unsettling are the gaps, the missing hours where her path should have been clear, but instead fractures into uncertain witness accounts and conflicting recollections. There was no obvious struggle on the streets, no cries for help that anyone could recall. And yet, by nightfall, a life that had begun so routinely had slipped into mystery. When you think about it, that may be the most haunting detail of all. How an ordinary day can turn into the last day without anyone realizing it in the moment. For Madge Kirby, the quiet morning walk, the brief stop at the shop, the promise to return home for lunch, all of it now reads like the final lines of a story that would never be finished. And as the community awoke to the news that she was missing, whispers began to swell. What had happened between her last confirmed sighting and the moment the sun went down? Who was the man some claimed to see her with? And why did no one hear or see more? These questions formed the foundation of what would soon become a formal investigation, one that would search for answers in interviews, evidence, and rumors alike, but would find only more shadows in the places where clarity should have been. When Madge Kirby was first reported missing, the police response was careful, though not immediate. In those early hours, there was still the lingering belief that she might return on her own, that this was simply a misunderstanding. But by the following morning, with no sign of her, officers began to take her disappearance seriously. The first step was retracing her movements. Police walked the same streets Madge had been seen traveling, questioning shopkeepers, neighbors, and anyone who might have caught a glimpse of her. The dressmaker confirmed she had stopped by briefly that morning, but nothing seemed unusual. A bookstall owner recalled her browsing around mid-morning, though his memory of the exact time wavered. Others along the route offered scattered, often conflicting recollections. Some swore they had seen her speaking with a man near the edge of town. Others were certain she had been alone. It quickly became apparent that the case would hinge on memory fragile, subjective, and easily clouded by time. As the investigation widened, police began compiling a list of those who might have had reason to speak with Madge that day. Her acquaintances were interviewed, fellow workers at the dressmaker's, family friends, and young men who had once shown her attention. One of the first names to arise was a man she had been casually acquainted with, someone known in the community for his temper. He claimed not to have seen her in weeks, but others remembered him lingering near the market on the morning she disappeared. When asked to account for his time, his statements grew vague. Still, without tangible evidence, suspicion could not be solidified. Another potential lead pointed toward a married neighbor with whom Madge was rumored to have quarreled. Some said she had rebuffed advances. Others claimed there was ongoing tension between the families. He denied any involvement, insisting he had been at work all day. His wife vouched for him, though some doubted the strength of her alibi. And then there was the stranger theory, possibility that Madge had encountered someone from outside town. Several townspeople described seeing a man they did not recognize loitering near the crossroads in the days before her disappearance. Was this coincidence, or had he been watching? Police made inquiries, but no definitive identity was ever established. What frustrates us, even today, is the stark absence of physical evidence. There was no crime scene, no personal belongings left behind to mark her trail. Her handbag, gloves, and had-all items she would likely have carried were never recovered. Police searched the woods, rivers, and abandoned buildings near town. Volunteers combed fields with lanterns at night, calling her name. But the earth yielded nothing. No signs of a struggle, no discarded clothing, no footprints pointing to a hidden grave. The only fragments of evidence were words, statements that contradicted each other, observations colored by rumor, and memories distorted by fear. And here lies one of the greatest limitations of the era. Forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no fingerprints taken from shop counters, no fibers collected from coats, no photographs carefully catalogued as modern investigators might do today. Police worked with what they had: witness testimony, hunches, and dogged persistence. But the trail was already cooling. As word spread, newspapers seized upon the story. The disappearance of a young woman always captured attention, and headlines began to frame Madge as both a victim and a symbol. Some papers described her as virtuous and innocent. Others hinted at impropriety, suggesting she may have run away or been involved in secret liaisons. This duality shaped public perception. On one hand, there was sympathy for the Kirby family, who waited anxiously for news. On the other, there was suspicion, a tendency to question Madge's character, as though her actions might explain her fate. Even in the absence of facts, stories circulated freely. The media coverage also pressured police. Each passing day without resolution deepened criticism, with some accusing authorities of negligence. Others believed they were withholding information, perhaps to shield someone of influence. In this atmosphere of rumor and distrust, the investigation often seemed as much about managing perception as it was about uncovering truth. Perhaps the most damaging obstacle was the sheer inconsistency of what people claimed to have seen. One farmer insisted he spotted her near the woods that evening in the company of a man. Another swore he heard a woman's voice calling out near the riverbank, though he could not be certain it was Madge. A shopkeeper later changed his story, first saying she had seemed cheerful that morning, then claiming she looked distressed. Such contradictions frustrated police efforts. Each new account required time to verify, and more often than not, the trail led nowhere. And as stories shifted, it became increasingly difficult to separate fact from fabrication. The investigation was not without its peculiar turns. At one point, a tip suggested Madge had been seen boarding a carriage bound for another town, possibly eloping in secret. Police pursued this lead, only to discover the woman in question was someone else entirely. Another bizarre claim came from a passerby who insisted he saw a bundle being carried into the woods late at night. Search parties scoured the area, but nothing was found. And then there was the unsettling rumor of a traveling salesman who had been moving through nearby villages. Some claimed he had been seen speaking to Madge days before her disappearance. But by the time police tracked him down, he had already moved on, leaving little to connect him to the case. Looking back, one cannot help but notice certain peculiarities in the way police handled the case. For instance, though neighbors reported unusual noises and sightings on the night she vanished, there seemed to be little effort to follow up rigorously. Some testimony was never formally recorded. Other witnesses later claimed they had been dismissed too quickly, told their accounts were unlikely or irrelevant. There were also whispers that certain suspects' men of social standing were quietly shielded from scrutiny. Whether this was due to lack of evidence or subtle bias is difficult to determine, but it left many feeling that justice had not been pursued evenly. As days turned to weeks, frustration mounted. The Kirby family continued to plead for answers, but the silence grew heavier. Neighbors speculated endlessly. Some believed she had met with foul play. Others clung to the hope that she might return. But with no body, no definitive evidence, the truth remained elusive. And perhaps that is what makes the case of Madge Kirby so haunting. It is defined not by what we know, but by what we cannot grasp. The police investigation, despite its efforts, could only circle around shadows. Each lead seemed promising at first, only to dissolve into uncertainty. What remained were questions fragmented, unsettling, and unresolved. Who was the man seen with her? Why did her path vanish so abruptly after the morning hours? And why, despite all the searching, was nothing concrete ever found? The investigation, with all its contradictions and dead ends, became less about finding answers and more about highlighting the limits of human memory, human bias, and the fragile structures of early police work. And as weeks bled into months, the realization dawned. Whatever had happened to Madge, the truth was slipping further from reach. When someone vanishes, the simplest explanation is often the one that takes root first. For Madge Kirby, that explanation was tragically familiar, that she had fallen victim to someone she already knew, someone close enough to gain her trust and use it against her from the beginning. Many in the community whispered the same suspicion, that a man in Madge's orbit had lured her away and harmed her. After all, disappearances rarely occur in complete isolation. They tend to happen in the quiet spaces between familiarity and betrayal, where trust can be exploited in the most devastating ways. The man who drew the most scrutiny was the acquaintance often described as temperamental. Some remembered him hovering near the market. Others said he had tried unsuccessfully to court Madge in the past. Motive, many believed, could have stemmed from rejection. If Madge had refused his advances, or if rumors about her had reached him, he may have felt spurned, his pride bruised in a small-town setting where appearances carried weight. Anger, jealousy, and humiliation could easily turn volatile, and crucially, he had opportunity. If he truly encountered Madge that day, even briefly, he would have had the chance to draw her aside under the guise of conversation. A meeting that might have begun innocently could have escalated into something irreversible. There are fragments of testimony that lend weight to this possibility. A witness recalled seeing Madge speaking to a man near the edge of town. His description loosely matched the acquaintance in question. Others suggested she looked uneasy in that interaction, as though she wanted to leave, but felt constrained by politeness. Then there was the matter of his alibi, which seemed frustratingly vague. When questioned, he offered only generalities. He had been around, he had been seen by others. But when pressed for names or times, his answers faltered. Even his demeanor drew attention. Some described him as evasive, defensive, and unusually quick to anger when the subject of Madge was raised. To investigators, such behavior did not constitute proof, but it certainly stirred suspicion. For police and public alike, this theory made sense. It required no elaborate conspiracies, no mysterious strangers. It followed the all-too-familiar pattern of violence born out of personal grievance. A young woman rejects a man. The man lashes out. The woman disappears. It was an explanation that resonated with the era's assumptions about crime and morality. Newspapers hinted at it, though never outright accused. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, careful not to level charges without evidence. And yet, despite its simplicity, something about the theory never quite resolved itself. The most glaring issue was absence. If this man had harmed Madge, where was the proof? No weapon, no clothing, no body, nothing ever tied him to the disappearance. The search of his home and grounds revealed nothing suspicious. His belongings, his clothing, his carriage all appeared unremarkable. Then there was the matter of timing. Several townspeople later insisted they had seen him elsewhere at the critical hour. While these accounts were inconsistent, they introduced enough doubt to weaken the case against him. And perhaps most compelling was Madge's own character. Friends described her as cautious, even wary, around men she did not fully trust. Would she have willingly walked off with him? Or would she have avoided him, as she had done before? If she had felt uncomfortable in his company, it's difficult to imagine her accompanying him into a situation where harm could occur unnoticed. There's also the haunting silence that followed. In cases of domestic or familiar violence, something usually surfaces: whispers of an argument, unexplained injuries, sudden disappearances of items. But here, there was nothing. If this man was responsible, he left behind no trace, no echo of his actions. And in a small town where secrets rarely remain hidden, that absence feels almost unnatural. And so we are left with an uneasy balance. On one side, a theory that fits neatly. A rejected man, a moment of rage, a young woman silenced. On the other, a void of evidence that makes the story feel unsteady. Like a picture missing its central piece. Many believe this man was guilty, that his behavior, his proximity, and his lack of alibi point squarely to him. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. If he was indeed the one responsible, why has nothing ever surfaced? Why did no clue, no confession, no slip of the tongue in all these years ever bring the truth closer? The obvious answer feels in many ways the most convincing. But it also leaves us with the most haunting doubt, that even when the solution seems clear, reality may be far murkier than we are willing to admit. If the most obvious answer in Madge Kirby's case is that someone close to her was responsible, the second theory unsettles us in a different way. It suggests that perhaps her fate had nothing to do with the people she knew at all. but rather that she crossed paths with a stranger, someone who appeared briefly in town and vanished just as quickly. In the days leading up to her disappearance, a handful of witnesses claimed to have noticed unfamiliar faces passing through the area. One man was described as a traveling salesman, another as a laborer moving between farms. Neither was ever directly linked to Madge, but the timing is difficult to ignore. Could it be possible that on that ordinary afternoon, she encountered one of these men by chance? If so, it would explain why those closest to her were unable to provide meaningful answers. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from within the circle we trust, but from an unknown face we never expect to meet again. What makes this possibility all the more haunting are the faint echoes of other disappearances in nearby towns during that same period. Newspapers carried scattered reports of young women who went missing with little explanation, their stories fading into obscurity as quickly as they appeared. None of those cases were ever solved, and none were definitively tied to Madge, yet the similarities are unsettling. It's hard not to wonder whether there was a broader pattern, something that, at the time, authorities failed to recognize. Could there have been a predator moving between towns, taking advantage of rural isolation, leaving each community to believe its tragedy was an isolated event? The idea lingers, uncomfortable but difficult to dismiss. Part of what sustains this theory is the abruptness with which Madge's trail went cold. Beyond one or two vague descriptions of a young woman seen walking, there were no definitive sightings. It was as if she had stepped off the path and disappeared into thin air. When a disappearance leaves behind so little evidence, it raises the troubling possibility of outside involvement. A stranger would have had no reason to linger, no ties to the community, and no one to notice his absence when he left. In some ways, it is the very lack of evidence that makes this scenario feel so chilling, because sometimes silence itself is the most telling clue. Whispers also persist of a different kind of unsettling explanation, that Madge's disappearance may have involved someone not only unknown, but powerful. Not necessarily a close relation, but an individual with enough influence or authority to ensure that certain suspicions were never pursued. It is, of course, speculation, but history is full of cases where inconvenient leads were quietly set aside. The idea that Madge's fate could have been entangled with such a figure only deepens the unease, leaving us to wonder whether the truth was deliberately obscured. This theory of the outsider, whether a fleeting stranger or someone hidden in plain sight, continues to draw attention because it fills the void left by the first explanation. If those within Madge's life left behind no convincing evidence, then perhaps that is because the answer lay elsewhere, beyond the familiar boundaries of her world. It is a theory at once haunting and unsatisfying haunting, because it reminds us how vulnerable we are to chance encounters. Unsatisfying because it leaves us with no clear resolution, only the disturbing thought that the person responsible could have slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind nothing but silence. In the end, this explanation rests not on evidence, but on absence, the absence of proof against the obvious suspect, the absence of answers from the investigation, the absence of closure for those who searched for her. And yet it endures, because the unknown has a way of unsettling us more than anything else. While it is tempting to believe that tragedies only arise from the familiar, the harder truth may be that sometimes they come from the places we least expect and from people we never truly see. That possibility that Madge's disappearance was the result of an encounter with the unknown is perhaps the most haunting of all. As the weeks turned into months, and the initial urgency of Madge Kirby's disappearance began to fade, the case quietly slipped into that grim category we know all too well, an unsolved mystery. What began with frantic searches, newspaper headlines, and whispered speculations soon dwindled into silence. The authorities had run every lead they could find, yet the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. There were no conclusive suspects, No decisive witness statements, and perhaps most damning of all, no physical evidence strong enough to anchor the investigation. Without answers, the case that once consumed a town slowly became another cold file on a shelf. For Madge's family, this slow unraveling was its own kind of torment. In the beginning, there was hope, a fragile belief that at any moment she might walk through the door or be found safe in some unexpected place. But as time dragged on, that hope began to thin, replaced by the quiet ache of uncertainty. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar letter, every phone call seemed like it could hold the answer, but it never did. The not knowing was worse than anything. For her mother, it was said that every day carried the unbearable ritual of setting the table and catching herself before laying out Madge's place. A small gesture that spoke volumes about a grief suspended in time. Unanswered questions loomed like shadows over the investigation. Why had there been no definitive sightings after that afternoon? Why did conflicting witness statements never quite align, leaving gaps wide enough to swallow the truth? Why was there no trace, no clothing, no belongings, no note? Each unanswered question compounded the sense of unease. It wasn't just that the authorities failed to solve the case. It was that the absence of answers left a void where any possibility seemed plausible, from the mundane to the horrifying. And within that void, rumors thrived. Some locals grew frustrated with the police, quietly wondering whether crucial opportunities had been missed in those first few days. The lack of advanced forensic tools at the time only deepened the problem. Today, we rely on DNA testing, digital forensics, and extensive databases to connect threads across jurisdictions. But in Madge's time, investigators were limited to eyewitness testimony, physical searches, and basic comparisons. That meant that once the trail ran dry, there was very little to sustain momentum. And so, with nothing concrete to hold on to, the story of Madge Kirby slipped further into mystery. The public, too, moved on, at least outwardly. Newspapers that once ran her name in bold headlines eventually shifted to new stories, new scandals, new tragedies. But for those who remembered her, the silence was its own kind of noise. Conversations lingered in kitchens and church pews, spoken softly as though saying her name too loudly might conjure ghosts. Parents told their children to be careful when walking alone, warnings rooted not only in caution, but in the haunting memory of a girl who left one day and never returned. Over the years, there were occasional sparks anonymous tips, letters sent to the police, whispers of sightings in neighboring towns. Each time, the family's hopes would rise, only to collapse again when the lead proved hollow. One particularly strange letter claimed that Madge had run away with a man she barely knew, starting a new life under a different name. Another tip suggested that her remains were buried in an abandoned field just beyond the edge of town. Searches were conducted, and nothing was found. These fragments, though intriguing, ultimately added nothing but more uncertainty to an already fragile story. As decades passed, the case was reopened several times, often coinciding with anniversaries, or when new investigators hoped to bring fresh eyes to the file. But each attempt met the same dead end. Time itself had become the enemy. Witnesses grew old, memories blurred, records were lost, and those who might have known something took their secrets to the grave. What remained were fragments, a few notes in case files, a scattering of newspaper clippings, and the lingering ache of a family that never found closure. Today, the story of Madge Kirby survives not through evidence, but through memory and speculation. It has become one of those quiet, haunting tales that persist precisely because it was never resolved. And perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling. A solved crime allows us to make sense of tragedy, to place it into order, even if the outcome is grim. But an unsolved case like Madge's leaves us with nothing but questions, hanging in the air like echoes that never fade. What happened that afternoon? Did she fall victim to someone close, or was it a stranger who crossed her path at the wrong time? And why, after so much searching, was there never a trace? The trail has long gone cold, but the mystery remains warm in memory. In the quiet retelling of her story, we are reminded of how fragile a single life can be, how quickly someone can vanish without explanation. And in that silence, the unanswered questions linger, not just for her family, but for anyone who dares to reflect on the truth that sometimes, despite our best efforts, the answers never come. And so, the mystery of Madge Kirby remains unsolved, unanswered, and quietly haunting. Her story lingers not just because of what happened, but because of what we may never know. Sometimes, the silence left behind speaks louder than any conclusion. If you had heard of this case before, or if you have your own thoughts on what might have happened, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Stories like Madge's remind us how fragile life is, and how easily truth can slip through time's fingers. Thank you for joining me in exploring this forgotten story. If you'd like to hear more haunting cases, quiet investigations, and mysteries that still echo, I invite you to subscribe. Together, we can keep these voices alive, ensuring that those lost to time are never entirely forgotten.